Chapter 24. Dinner. In time, the sun fell away from the land, and the ponies that were out and about in the fields retired to their homes for the evening. Scarlet and Lens made their way back to the home of Applejuice and Windrain, keeping their pace slow and relaxed. By the time they arrived at the cozy little house, Luna's moon had begun its slow but ever-steady ascent into the heavens, shining down onto the world in a waxing crescent. The moment they stepped inside, Scarlet's mouth watered. Her nostrils were inundated with a powerful and tantalizing aroma of a home-cooked meal. Her eyes followed her nose, and she caught sight of Applejuice by the fireplace, where a cauldron of soup was bubbling. She could also see 2 loaves of freshly baked bread set off to one side, their tops coated with a thin scattering of some kind of seed. Windrain was seated not far away, her eyes trained down as she worked on something that Scarlet couldn't quite see from here. She could hear water sloshing about, and the way wind was moving indicated she was scrubbing. She was washing something then. Scarlet's eyes wandered briefly away from the family and settled onto a pair of shimmering eyes in one of the doorways. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively went to cry out Primrose's name, believing for a moment that the filly was finally up. But, to her combined curiosity and disappointment, the eyes were the wrong color. Instead of Primrose's dark teal, these were an intense shade of aquamarine. The moment those eyes realized they had been spotted, they ducked out of sight, hiding behind the door. Scarlet raised an eyebrow curiously, but chose not to pursue the matter for now. Instead, she turned to Applejuice and Windrain, watching as Lens made the approach. The stallion hummed eagerly, before adjusting his glasses. "That smells wonderful! When will it be ready?" Juice chuckled and looked back at him with a coy smile. "Not long. Just waiting on the ears, I think." Scarlet's face morphed into one of complete and utter scandalization. She turned to Lens, her ears drooping and her eyebrows angling up in dismay. "What? Lens! You did not!" she snapped in an odd mixture of accusation and defiance.
"He sure did, sugar,"
Wind replied for him with a wink.
"We got some of those elephant ears in the oven right now."
Lens wore a crooked, sheepish grin, scuffing the floor awkwardly with his hoof.
"Well, I mean, just after how hard you worked to save Prim, I thought you'd like the treat,"
he attempted, his grin growing more and more strained as Scarlet continued to glare at him. She tried so very hard to look unamused, but eventually she heaved a heavy sigh and looked down with a quiet chuckle.
"You know how embarrassing my favorite food is,"
she droned out before hauling herself over to the table. Lens shrugged helplessly.
"Hey, I know you love it."
Scarlet leveled a flat glare at him, but chose not to say anything else for the time being. Instead, she sat down to take the weight off of her hooves and get comfy at the dinner table. Wind giggled merrily at the display before returning her attention to whatever it was she was still grubbing. A few seconds passed before she let out a satisfied sigh and sat upright, hauling the item up with her and holding it in front of her. Scarlet's eyes widened as she saw her cloak, now clean of muck, mud, and blood, rising from the water basin. The fabric was dripping wet and still tattered in various places, but was otherwise clean. Wind set it down by the fire to dry before giving Scarlet a warm smile.
"It was all filthy. It needed a good cleaning. I hope you don't mind."
Scarlet's chest tightened involuntarily, and before she knew it, she was back on her hooves and walking over. She sat down next to the cloak, ignoring Wind's confused stare for a few seconds. She reached down and traced a hoof over the fabric where she had torn the strips off, and she felt a pang of guilt travel through her heart. Despite the increasing urge to start shaking, Scarlet maintained her composure. She gave Wind a small, strained smile.
I don't mind. Thank you. This cloak has a lot of sentimental value to me,
she said quietly. Wind's smile slowly returned, softer this time.
Least I could do. After everything you've been through, and everything I imagine you're gonna go through in the future.
Lens slowly approached, a tentative look on his face. Scarlet glanced up at him, meeting his gaze. The two fell silent for a time, before Lens cleared his throat and asked the question on his mind.
If you don't mind my asking, why is that cloak so important to you?
Applejuice glanced over with a raised eyebrow. You mean you don't know?
We've only been traveling together for a week or two,
Scarlet pointed out, before focusing on the dark blue fabric in her hooves. Despite the moisture soaking it, she lifted it up to her chest over her heart and closed her eyes.
As for why, this cloak was a gift from some pony very, very dear to my heart.
A silence fell over the room. Scarlet heard Lens setting down before she felt his hoof on her back, and she could practically feel the confused glances that Wind and Applejuice exchanged. Thankfully, the farmers decided not to question her answer. Odds were that they sensed the sensitive subject matter and chose not to pry. After a short time, the sound of a metal hatch opening and a happy exclamation from Juice drew Scarlet out of her somber memories. She opened her eyes to see him reaching into the oven and pulling out a large, flat pan with a series of similarly large, flat pastries on it. Ha-ha! Not quite the way they're supposed to be made, Applejuice apologized as he brought it out, but I don't got the equipment to do it right. Basically just some flat bread with cinnamon and sugar sprinkled on. Scarlet shook her head to dismiss his explanation, before setting her cloak back down and rising to her hooves.
It's fine. Frankly, I'll just be glad to have a decent meal,
she told him before turning and making her way back for the table, this time with Lens by her side. He kept looking at her with a worried frown, and it became pretty evident that he was wanting to ask her something. She preempted him by giving him a small, albeit sad, smile.
Don't worry, Lens. I'm fine,
she said in a whisper before sitting down. The stallion considered her words from her side for a moment. Then, with a quick flick of his magic, he brought over an unoccupied chair from the corner of the room and sat down next to Scarlet, bringing the number of chairs at the table up to 5. Right. Grub's ready, Applejuice declared a moment later before standing up. Wind, y'all mind getting our guests served while I find Star? Wind nodded and set to work while her husband left the room. With quick, practiced motions, she filled up a series of bowls with soup before bringing them over to the table. She set them down in front of Scarlet and Lens, as well as a plate with the makeshift elephant ears on them. She smiled warmly.
Don't worry about waiting for us, you two. You especially, miss. You need the food more than the rest of us.
Scarlet went to object to the idea, not wanting to be rude in the home of the ponies that had saved her life, but her stomach had other ideas, banishing that sentiment from her mouth and swiftly replacing it with one of the elephant ears. She mumbled out a muffled response as her teeth dug in, and her eyes rolled up into her skull as the cinnamon and sugar met her tongue.
Not a true elephant ear, to be sure,
she internally acknowledged, before swallowing and shuddering.
But I don't care. I need this.
Soon enough, Applejuice returned with a little earth pony colt by his side. He had a grayish-brown coat and short, messy, navy blue mane and tail. His aquamarine eyes looked at Scarlet, shimmering with curiosity, but also anxiety. She gave him a friendly smile in an effort to show him that she was nice, and that did a little to make him ease up. His father nudged him from above, making the full glance up at him. Don't be rude, Applejuice said to the colt in a hushed voice.
Introduce yourself.
The fool stared at his father for a few seconds before reluctantly hopping up into his seat. He hesitated for a second before looking at Scarlet.
Howdy. My name's Apple Star.
He greeted quietly, his eyes averting themselves partway through. Scarlet's smile softened considerably at the timid greeting. She swallowed her mouthful of pastry before answering.
Hello. I'm Scarlet Frost. It's nice to meet you,
she said before holding out a hoof to him. He eyed it for a few seconds before reaching out and shaking. The brief contact finally seemed to be enough to make him lighten up, and his face brightened with a warm smile.
Nice to meet you, ma'am,
he said with far more energy than before.
You're the one that's been taking care of Primrose, ain't you?
Scarlet withdrew her hoof and nodded.
Well, I can't take all of the credit, but I suppose you could say that, yes.
How has she been?
Scarlet hummed thoughtfully, her brow furrowing.
Well, she
began, but the words hitched in her throat. She looked at Star and withered somewhat at his imploring eyes.
She's certainly been better. We've been on the road a lot, so she's tired and worn out and...
Mama and Papa said she got hurt by a bad pony,
Star pointed out, glancing over at his parents.
And they said you and Sharpie saved her.
Lens pouted at the nickname.
But hey! I'm Sharp Lens, not Sharpie.
Scarlet chuckled at his indignation before nodding her head, her ears drooping.
Well, yes, that is true. Primrose was hurt by a very bad pony, yes. But she's going to be fine, thanks to your mother.
Applestar grinned before shoving his snout into his bowl of soup and digging energetically into his meal. Or at least he started to before his father lightly tapped him on the head with a stern look. Come on, boy, show some manners. Star pouted, but did as he had been told, eating with far better table manners than before. Windrain smiled softly at the two before looking back to Scarlet.
So, Scarlet, how are you feeling now that you've been up and about for a few hours?
She asked.
I'm still tired, but I'll manage,
Scarlet replied before taking another bite from the elephant ears. When she swallowed, she continued.
This is hardly the first time I've suffered grievous injuries, after all.
Wind hummed quietly in response to that before returning to her own meal. Applejuice was next.
So, Scarlet, Lens, what are y'all planning to do now?
He asked, looking between the two with a raised eyebrow.
I don't imagine you're going to be sticking around here forever.
Scarlet went rigid with the spoon halfway to her mouth. What were they going to do? If she were being wholly honest with herself, she had not given that question much thought yet either. They couldn't stay here forever, obviously. Silent probably thought Primrose was dead, but without the lamp, his mission would only be half finished, meaning he would be after them again before long. His injuries did need time to heal, of course, and that would take time. But that only gave them time, not options. They couldn't stay. They would only be putting the lives of innocent ponies in danger if they did, but what other options were open to them? Scarlet sighed and lowered her spoon.
I don't know yet. We won't be staying here, but I don't know where else we can go,
she admitted regretfully.
You can't stay?
Applestar asked, crooking his head to one side.
Why not?
Scarlet turned to him.
Because we're being followed by the same bad ponies that hurt Primrose. If we stay here for too long, they'll just hurt you and your parents too, and I cannot allow that to happen. Not after all you've done for us.
Star wilted in his seat, but despite his disappointment, he seemed to understand. He nodded his head quietly. Lens cleared his throat, leaning forward to speak.
Well, it's a bit of a risk, but we could try and get to New Canter.
Scarlet's ears stood up in alarm. She turned to face Lens incredulously.
What? Go to the capital? Are you mad?
She demanded, 1,000,001 ways that plan could go wrong flashing through her mind. Lens leaned back from the outburst.
Hey, we need to learn more about the lamp, don't we?
He reminded with a frown.
I went to the academy in New Canter before and after the war. The teachers there know and trust me. They'll let us use their facilities to conduct my research. Yes, but that's the capital,
Scarlet pressed in a low voice, mindful of the young foal in her midst.
We don't want to get too close to that if we can help it. There must be somewhere else we can go with the tools you need. What about the sanctuary?
Scarlet's expression shifted from exasperation to confusion. She turned to the speaker to find Star looking back with a quizzical look on his face. Scarlet cleared her throat.
Excuse me, but what?
Star glanced towards Primrose's room.
Primrose used to tell me about this place her mama told her about. A sanctuary where ponies like her could go to be safe. It's got 2 powerful guardians to protect it from anything that might attack it. A sanctuary?
Lens echoed with a raised eyebrow. He turned to Scarlet.
I haven't heard anything about that. Did Primrose ever mention anything to you?
Scarlet looked back at the closed door, a whole new barrage of questions about the young foal running through her mind. She slowly shook her head.
No. No, she didn't. Well, it sounds promising,
Lens admitted before turning back to Star.
Did she ever mention where it was?
Star shook his head.
Nope. She always said she didn't know where it was, but that she was always going to keep looking for it, just like her mom and pa.
It was probably just a little foal story her mother told her,
Applejuice said, his eyes downcast.
Something to keep her happy and optimistic, kind of like a fairy tale.
Star turned to his father with an indignant pout.
Ma, her sanctuary's real. I know it. Her mama believed it. They were looking for she lost him.
Scarlet's eyes lingered on the door while the ponies argued back and forth about the veracity of this so-called sanctuary. But after a time, she shook her head and turned back to the table, cutting the argument off before it could carry on.
Whether it's real or not doesn't matter. We cannot risk our lives searching for something that might only turn out to be a fable, especially if we have no idea where to even start looking. We need another option. I still think we could go to New Canter, even if only for a short time,
Lens pressed, his brow furrowing.
It's our best shot at getting answers about the lamp.
Scarlet shook her head.
Forgive me, Lens, but I'm more interested in making sure we're somewhere safe before anything else,
she told him before closing her eyes and going into thought. The conversation around the table carried on for a while as she ran through a range of options, most of which she was quick to shoot down for one reason or another. Her train of thought was interrupted when Applestar suddenly spoke up.
Mama? Papa? Is Primrose gonna leave again?
Scarlet opened her eyes and looked to the foal. All eyes had turned to him, and he looked around with an uneasy look on his face. He cleared his throat.
I really missed her. And now she's back home and I don't want her to go again,
he elaborated before turning back to his parents.
Can't you stay with us, Mama? Papa? Please?
Juice and Wind shared a hesitant glance.
Well,
Wind began slowly.
I don't know, dear.
We'd all love for her to stay,
Applejuice eventually said, adjusting his hat on his head.
But she's been gone for a long time, and she's been with Scarlet here for quite a while too. She might want to stick with her.
Star's ears drooped, and he leaned forward in his seat to protest.
But Papa, she's part of the family. I don't want to see her go. It sucks missing her. And what if she forgets us?
Scarlet chose this moment to cut in, lowering her head to be closer to Star's eye level.
Hey,
she called out to him, drawing his attention. She smiled.
Primrose really missed you. All of you. She missed you so much, in fact, that when we were desperate for somewhere to go, she suggested we come here to you.
Yeah, she was rather insistent on that point,
Lens concurred.
And because we knew about you and where to go, we got her here when she was hurt so you could save her.
Scarlet's smile grew.
She left for a good reason, little colt. She left to protect all of you from some very bad ponies that would have hurt you to get to her. She never forgot you. And she missed you all so much that when it mattered, it saved her life.
Star was quiet. He slumped back in his chair, his eyes shifting sporadically as he processed Scarlet's words. Eventually, he looked up at her, his ears slowly lifting back up.
Promise me you'll keep her safe if she goes away again.
Scarlet sat upright and placed a hoof over her chest.
I will protect her with my life, as if she were my own. I swear it,
she said solemnly, and she meant every word. A silence fell over the table after that, every pony's mood significantly diminished. Scarlet closed her eyes and took a deep breath to settle her nerves and just relax. Sadly, it was easier said than done. That was, of course, until she heard the soft ringing of a magical aura fill her ears, followed shortly by something stiff and sweet-smelling poking against her nose. She cracked one eye open to glare in irritation at who she knew the culprit to be. Sure enough, there was Lens with a hopeful smile on his face, holding another elephant ear up to her lips in his magic.
Come on,
he urged her lightly.
This is dinner. Let's eat before it gets cold, huh?
Scarlet let out a long, quiet whine of absolute humiliation before opening her mouth and letting Lens slip the elephant ear into her mouth. She took a bite before glaring at him. Then she heard Star giggling and couldn't help the tiny smile that spread on her face. Lens smiled back at her. She swallowed her mouthful of food and turned back to the family.
Lens is right. Enough sad talk,
she decided. No pony at the table had any objections to that plan, and they all quickly began to dig into what remained of their respective meals. The atmosphere quickly brightened as the subject of discussion shifted from such dire things and meandered to the mundanity of farm life. For the duration of that meal, Scarlet allowed herself to finally relax and feel like she was just living again. As she ate and talked with the kind strangers before her, she found the idea of someday settling down in a small community like this becoming more and more appealing. Sometime later, Scarlet stepped into the room she shared with Primrose. Lens had since departed back for the shed, where he had managed to throw together a makeshift bed for himself. He had insisted that Scarlet take the bed across from Primrose's, citing that she was still recovering from her own wounds, and the comfort would do her some good. She let out a quiet sigh as she closed the door behind her. She looked across the dark room and was just able to make out the soundly sleeping form of Primrose in the occupied bed. Scarlet stood still, listening to her breathing and watching her rest before pushing away from the door. She sat down on her haunches by the bedside, her horn lighting up so she could see the filly's face. Primrose's eyes were still closed, her mouth hanging open a little. She shifted slightly under the light, and her expression tensed with the movement. Her wounds were probably causing her pain from even the slightest change in position. Scarlet smiled gently and ran her hoof over her mane.
You're going to be fine, Prim,
she whispered.
You're going to live, and I am going to keep you safe, no matter what. I promise. I will not let Silent or anyone else hurt you ever again.
Primrose didn't respond, although her mouth slowly closed and morphed into a weak smile. Scarlet's heart fluttered at the small motion, and she leaned down to give the filly an affectionate nuzzle.
I hope you wake up soon. We all do. Apple Juice, Windrain, and Apple Star are all really eager to talk to you again. They've missed you very, very much.
Scarlet stayed like that for several minutes before pulling herself back to her hooves. She smiled down at Primrose one more time before turning and slipping into bed. In no time at all, her eyes drifted closed, and she felt herself falling into the world of dreams.